In the dark, musty corridors of medieval monasteries, a world of secrets and ancient knowledge thrived, hidden from the prying eyes of the common folk. Among the cloaked figures who wandered these halls were the friars men of the cloth, who, despite their vows of chastity, harbored a deep and sometimes scandalous interest in the workings of the human body, particularly in the realm of human procreation. This was a time when the boundaries between medicine, magic, and religion were blurred, and the friars, with their access to ancient texts and the private lives of the people, became the keepers of some of the most intimate and powerful knowledge of their age. One of the most intriguing documents from this era is the Tabula Medicine, a compendium that delves into the mysteries of conception, sexual intercourse, and pregnancy. The headings in this text: conceptio, conception; coitus, sexual intercourse; impregnare, impregnation; libido, libido; pregnans, pregnancy; pure, child; and sterilitas, sterility, speak volumes about the friars' fascination with the human reproductive process. The section on mulier, woman, is particularly telling, as it focuses on methods to test a woman's virginity, a concern deeply rooted in the need to ensure patrilineal succession. The importance of such tests cannot be overstated, as they were crucial for maintaining the social order and the legitimacy of heirs in a world where lineage was everything. Another key text in this tradition is the Liber uricrisiarum by the friar Henry Daniel, written around 1375 to 1382. This book, like the Tabula Medicine, devotes significant space to the detection of pregnancy through the examination of urine. Daniel introduces his readers to various experiments, or experimenta, that were believed to reveal whether a woman was pregnant. One such test, attributed to Hippocrates, involved giving a woman a drink called melicratum, and observing whether she experienced pain. Another, taken from the Liber de Synthematis Mulierum, book on the symptoms of women in the trachela, involved the man and woman urinating in separate pots filled with bran. These pots were left for a week or two, and the party at fault for the woman's inability to conceive would be identified by the presence of worms and a foul odor. Daniel, however, was not without his reservations. While he was willing to endorse these experimenta for questions of fertility, he was wary of those who claimed to use urine to determine the father of a child or predict the sex or color of a calf. He derided such practitioners as unwise leches and dog leches, accusing them of being more interested in profit and empty chatter than in genuine knowledge. This skepticism is further reflected in the Latin verse epilogue of the Liber uricrisiarum, where he launches a scathing attack on those who claim to know the paternity of a fetus or the future appearance of livestock through the examination of urine. The medical culture of the English friars was deeply influenced by the writings of Roger Bacon, a 13th-century friar and philosopher whose works emphasized the importance of alchemy, astrology, and experimental science. Bacon believed that by studying these sciences, humanity could restore its original state of health and longevity, a belief that resonated strongly with the friars. They embraced alchemical practices, such as the creation of elixirs and quintessences, and explored the use of astrology to understand the influence of the stars on human health. Despite Bacon's caution against some of the more dubious practices, his successors among the friars were more willing to experiment with natural magic, incantations, and divination, all in the name of healing. The friars' interest in women's medicine and human procreation, while seemingly at odds with their vows of chastity, was widely accepted and even encouraged. This acceptance was partly due to the friars' unique position in society, which allowed them greater access to the homes and personal lives of the people. Their role as confessors and spiritual advisors often extended to providing medical advice, and their knowledge of women's health and fertility was highly valued by the communities they served. In the world of medieval medicine, the friars were not just spiritual guides, but also guardians of a vast and often secretive body of knowledge. Their contributions to the medical and scientific understanding of their time were significant, and their legacy continues to fascinate and challenge our perceptions of the intersection between faith, science, and human nature. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the realms of medicine, magic, and astrology were deeply intertwined, particularly within the scholarly communities of the time. One of the key figures in this period was Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar and philosopher who explored the connections between these disciplines. Bacon believed that the study of nature, including the natural world and celestial phenomena, could lead to a deeper understanding of both the physical and the spiritual. Bacon's work, particularly his Opus Maius, delved into the practical applications of science, such as the use of experiments to test theories. He argued that true knowledge came from experience and observation, not just from abstract reasoning. This emphasis on empirical evidence was revolutionary for its time, and laid the groundwork for the scientific method that would develop in later centuries. One of Bacon's contemporaries, John of Pershore, wrote a treatise titled De Libris Licitis et Illicitis, which explored the boundaries between permissible and forbidden magical texts. This work reflects the ongoing debate within the Franciscan order about the appropriate use of magical and astrological practices. While some friars saw these practices as useful tools for understanding the world, others were more cautious, wary of the potential for these practices to lead to heresy or superstitious beliefs. The practical aspects of medicine and astrology were also well documented in various manuscripts. For example, the Problemata of Aristotle, a text that was often regarded as a medical treatise in the later Middle Ages, was frequently consulted by physicians. These texts often included practical advice on treating illnesses, using both natural remedies and incantations. Incantations, or spoken charms, were believed to have healing properties, and were a common feature of medieval medical practice. One manuscript, MS Digby 153, contains numerous examples of these incantations and practical medical advice. It was compiled by a Franciscan friar named Braille, who was particularly interested in the practical applications of the texts he studied. Braille's work shows a blend of scholarly knowledge and practical experience, reflecting the broader interests of medieval scholars who sought to combine theoretical knowledge with practical utility. The relationship between medicine and astrology was also significant. Astrological charts and calendars were used to determine the best times for medical treatments and surgeries. For instance, the Calendarium of John Summer, a Franciscan friar, provided detailed astrological information that could be used to guide medical practices. These calendars often included information on the positions of the planets and their influence on human health. Another notable figure in this context was Nicholas of Lynn, a Carmelite friar who also produced a calendarium. His work, like Summer's, was a practical guide for using astrology in medicine. These calendars were not just academic exercises, but were used by practicing physicians and astrologers to make informed decisions about patient care. The Franciscan order, in particular, played a significant role in the development and dissemination of these medical and astrological texts. Many Franciscan friars were involved in the study of natural philosophy, which encompassed a wide range of subjects, including astronomy, medicine, and the natural world. They compiled and copied manuscripts, ensuring that this knowledge was preserved and shared within their communities and beyond. One such manuscript, MS Ashmole 360, contains a text on nativities, which were astrological charts used to predict a person's future based on the positions of the planets at the time of their birth. This text, while not widely known, is an important example of the kinds of astrological and medical knowledge that were valued in medieval Franciscan circles. The practical applications of these texts extended beyond the cloister. They were used by physicians, astrologers, and even laypeople who sought to understand and influence their health and well-being. The blending of medical, astrological, and magical practices in these texts reflects the complex and multifaceted nature of medieval knowledge, where the boundaries between these disciplines were often blurred. In the late Middle Ages, the use of these practices began to be more closely regulated. As the church and secular authorities became more concerned about the potential for abuse and superstition, there were efforts to delineate what was permissible and what was not. Despite these efforts, the practical and empirical approach to knowledge that was championed by figures like Roger Bacon continued to influence the development of science and medicine in the centuries to come. In medieval times, the lines between medicine and religion were often blurred. Friars, who were religious men, played significant roles as preachers, confessors, teachers, and advisors. They wrote and used various texts to guide both the spiritual and physical well-being of people. These texts included sermons, advice books, and health regimens. The friars' roles in these areas were interconnected because they believed that the health of the soul and the body were deeply linked. One of the most famous works that friars used was the De Proprietatibus Rerum by Bartholomeus Anglicus. This book was like an encyclopedia of the world, covering everything from natural history to moral guidance. It was so popular because it could be used in many ways interpreting the Bible, giving examples for sermons, and providing advice on how to live a good life. Another important text was the Secretum Secretorum, which Roger Bacon edited. This book offered advice on ethics, politics, and health, and it was presented as if it were from Aristotle to Alexander the Great. Friars also wrote rules and guidelines for their own orders that covered both spiritual and physical aspects of life. For example, a Dominican rule from the 13th century included instructions on how to care for the sick, when to have bloodletting, a common medical practice at the time, and how to govern the community. These rules reflected the belief that the health of the body and the soul were interconnected. The concept of complexion and temperament was central to this idea. In medieval medicine, it was believed that a person's health was determined by the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors were influenced by factors like air, food, exercise, sleep, and emotions. Friars, as both medical advisors and spiritual guides, had to consider these factors when giving advice. For example, a confessor needed to understand a penitent's temperament to prescribe the right penance, just as a medical advisor needed to consider the same factors to recommend the right treatment. Friars used medical metaphors in their sermons to help people understand spiritual concepts. For instance, a sermon in a Dominican preacher's handbook from the late 13th century compared a preacher to a physician. The preacher, like a doctor, needed to have both the right tools, scriptures, and knowledge, and the skill to use them effectively. Without expertise, a preacher might do more harm than good, just as a doctor without knowledge might harm a patient. Another well-known text, the Fasciculus Morum, was a guide for preachers. It was organized around the 7 deadly sins and their corresponding virtues. Each section included stories and examples to help preachers teach their audience. For example, in the section on envy and love, the text described Christ as a physician who heals the soul. Just as a doctor diagnoses a patient by examining their urine and pulse, Christ helps the sinner understand their sins and repent. Christ then prescribes a diet of good behavior and a medicine of contrition. The text also used medical terms to describe the process of healing, such as sweat of contrition, bloodletting of confession, and plaster of prayer. In the section on sloth and occupation, the text explained how to make a good confession. It used medical metaphors to describe the process, such as the quality of a good confession being like a healthy body. A good confession required the penitent to be honest and thorough, just as a patient needs to be honest with their doctor to get the right treatment. These texts and practices show how deeply the friars believed in the connection between the health of the soul and the body. By using medical metaphors and considering the factors that influenced both, they aimed to guide people towards a balanced and virtuous life. In the medieval world, people often saw a general sweat as a sign of health, indicating that the body was expelling bad humor. However, if the sweat was only on certain parts of the body, like the hands or feet, it was seen as a bad omen, suggesting that the person might be near death. This idea was similar to how people viewed confession. Just as a general sweat cleansed the body, a full confession could cleanse the soul. But a partial confession, like partial sweating, was seen as dangerous and could lead to spiritual death. The role of the priest in confession was compared to that of a medicinal herb. For example, there was an old belief that a wounded deer would seek out a herb called dittany to heal itself by drawing out the arrow. In the sermons, this herb was replaced with bitani, which was said to have the power to heal by drawing out the iron. Similarly, the priest was seen as the herb that could heal the soul wounded by sin. The sinner was encouraged to seek out the priest, just as the deer sought the herb to find healing and forgiveness. Medieval preachers used this analogy to emphasize the importance of repentance and confession. They often told stories to make their sermons more engaging and memorable. These stories might involve sick people who were healed not by medicine, but by confessing their sins and trusting in the sacraments. Other stories might end with the death of the sick person, but the focus was always on whether the soul was saved or damned. These tales were meant to inspire the audience to repent and turn to God. One example of a preacher who used such analogies was Malachy of Ireland, a Franciscan friar who wrote a text called De Septem Veninis, or On Poison. He compared each of the 7 deadly sins to venom from poisonous animals. He used these analogies to show how sin could spread, and how difficult it was to cure. He also provided remedies for sin, much like a physician would provide remedies for illness. His work was widely read and used by other preachers, often included in their sermons. Friars and preachers were known for their use of stories, or exempla, in their sermons. These stories were collected and shared among the friars to help them in their preaching. Some of the most famous collections include the Liber Exemplorum, a collection of stories compiled by a friar from Warwickshire, and the Speculum Lacorum, which contained many stories from East Anglia and Kent. These collections often included stories that were meant to teach moral lessons about vices and virtues. The friars' use of these stories was not limited to sermons. John of Wales, a Franciscan friar, wrote several works that used exempla to teach about the virtues of ancient rulers and philosophers. His works were widely read, and even used at dinner tables to provide topics of conversation. Other friars, like Robert Holcott, followed John's lead by using classical sources in their writings to address ethical and political subjects. At the sick and the deathbed, the roles of the confessor and the physician often overlap. Canon 22 of the Fourth Lateran Council emphasized that spiritual healing should take precedence over secular healing, but it also acknowledged that spiritual healing could benefit physical health. In many medieval depictions, both the confessor and the physician were present, each playing a crucial role in the healing process. The confessor was seen as a skilled physician for the soul, carefully examining the penitent's sins and providing advice and remedies. The process of confession was likened to a medical examination, where the confessor would diagnose the sin, predict its consequences, and prescribe the necessary actions for salvation. This parallel between the confessor and the physician highlighted the importance of both spiritual and physical care in medieval society. The role of confessors in the medieval church was seen as crucial, akin to that of physicians in healing the soul. Just as a physician needed training, so too did a confessor. The Lateran Council and English bishops emphasized the importance of training preachers and confessors, often through university-educated men and the new orders of friars. These friars, particularly the Dominicans and Franciscans, were instrumental in creating manuals and guides to help confessors in their duties. One of the earliest and most influential of these manuals was written by Thomas Chobham, an Englishman in the early 13th century. His Summa de Penitentia provided a comprehensive guide for priests preparing to hear confessions. The Dominicans, with their strong educational background, were especially well equipped to study and apply such works. Raymond of Pennafort, a Dominican, wrote Summa de Casibus Ponentiae, a detailed manual on canon law for confessors, which became widely used. John of Freiburg, another Dominican, expanded on Raymond's work with his Summa Confessorum, which integrated the moral theology of Thomas Aquinas. These manuals were highly practical, often including indices and tables of contents to help confessors find the information they needed quickly. While these works were primarily written by friars, some English authors also contributed. Peter Quesnel, a Franciscan, wrote Directorium Iuris in Foro Conscientiae, a guide intended to be accessible to poor clerics. The manual covered a range of topics, from the basics of the faith to more complex issues in canon law. The analogy between confession and medicine was a common theme. Jean Rigaud, a French Franciscan, described confession as a kind of medicine that purges evil humors and restores health. Robert Grosseteste, a prominent English bishop and scholar, used the image of an obstetrician removing a serpent to illustrate the confessor's role in purging sin and bringing about spiritual healing. Friars also wrote directly for laypeople, emphasizing the importance of penitence and confession. Richard Maidstone, a Carmelite, translated the 7 penitential psalms into English, framing them as a therapeutic bath to wash away the filth of sin. Thomas Brampton, a Franciscan, wrote a more literal translation of the penitential psalms, often interpreting affliction as a spiritual sickness and emphasizing the need for the clergy to guide the people. The Dives and Pauper, a dialogue written around 1405, further illustrated how friars could advise laypeople on leading virtuous lives. The text, rich with examples and poems, served as both a guide to lay spirituality and a resource for preachers. English friars also influenced the genre of princely advice, which included maintaining good health. The most famous of these texts, the Secretum Secretorum, was purportedly written by Aristotle to Alexander the Great. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan, edited and expanded this text, emphasizing the importance of a proper regimen of health and the use of powerful medical remedies. Bacon's version included detailed notes on medicine, astrology, and the use of rare ingredients to extend human life. Through these works, medieval confessors and preachers were equipped with the knowledge and guidance needed to care for the spiritual health of their communities, much like physicians cared for physical health. The intersection of medicine and spirituality in these texts highlights the holistic approach to well-being that characterized the medieval world.